Lying ill in bed, Tarsem Singh Sandhu faced up to the choice between the golden laws of his God and the ironclad rules of the Wolverhampton Transport Department. Like many other employers, the Transport Department enforced a no beards uniform code. And when Tarsem arrived in the United Kingdom from Punjab, his uncles had cut off his hair and shaved off his beard. Through 3 weeks of sick leave, though, Tarsem let his beard grow out again and showed up for work with a turban. The young immigrant was sent back home by his bosses, but his protests that day set off struggles over identity and race that would shape an age. England had been seized by culture wars in 1967, the years of Tarsem's protest. Some of you will remember it. Rolling Stones stars Keith Richards and Mick Jagger were arrested after a bizarre drugs raid, consensual gay sex had been decriminalized, and the right to abortion recognized. The pound had been devalued in a desperate effort to cut down imports. The backlash, though, was also forming. The newly formed British National Front had become the vanguard of a new wave of anti-immigrant violence, drawing on white working class fears about the change on their streets. Likely, a new immigrant, Kenya-born Yashvir Sunak, who had just begun studying medicine at the University of Liverpool, watched these events unfolding just 100 miles up the M6 highway with fascination as well as fear. Like other East African Asians, Yashvir and his to-be wife Shraksha had left their homelands amid growing racial tensions. England was their last refuge, but it wasn't clear how long immigrants would remain welcome. Their child, Rishi Sunak, is now Prime Minister at the head of a party that long stood for painting England whiter. Is this the final triumph of the new Britain that emerged from the culture wars of the 1960s? Or has the reactionary English ruling class just rebranded itself, well, with a little bit more colour? 80 years ago, the great novelist George Orwell observed that the English ruling class was an aristocracy constantly recruited from parvenues. England's masters, he argued, had a formidable talent for renewal, like a knife, Orwell wrote, which has had 2 new blades and 3 new handles. Even though the old land-owning aristocracy lost influence, it intermarried with the new industrial elite. The wealthy ship owner or cotton miller set up for himself an alibi as a country gentleman, Orwell wrote, while his sons learned the right mannerisms at public schools. The story of the rise of Sunak is, among other things, about the fluidity of the English elite and its very complex relationship with race. From its early decades, historians Philip Morgan and Sean Hawkins have noted, Imperial Britain used education as a tool to create native middle classes that were enmeshed in its culture and values. We all know the story of Dadabhai Nauroji. An early nationalist, he was the second Indian to be elected as a British Member of Parliament in 1892, following Anglo-Indian David Dyce. What is less well known, scholar Sumita Mukherjee records, is that the Conservatives also had an Indian MP elected just 3 years later in 1895. Even though race lurked just under the surface, the losing candidate George Howell bitterly wrote that he was kicked out by a black man. Victorian England had use for native gentlemen, or the right kinds of native gentlemen. The historian Jonathan Shear suggests that Mancherji Bhovanagri, a conservative politician of Parsi descent, personified the India of English aspiration. Loyal, assimilated, obsequious. The Conservative Party is arguably more racially diverse than ever in its existence. 6 of the 10 candidates to replace Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, Nadeem Zahawi, Sajid Javed and Rehman Chishti as well as Sunak, were from the ethnic minorities. The Tories gave the United Kingdom its first woman Home Secretary, Preeti Patel, and its first Muslim woman cabinet member, Sayeeda Warsi. Liz Truss's short-lived cabinet was the most diverse in British history. Even though this diversity is welcome, it isn't the whole story. The Conservatives are also the bastion of certain kinds of privilege. Like two-thirds of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's cabinet, research has shown, Sunak went to private schools, institutions which cater to just 7% of the United Kingdom's population. Prime Minister David Cameron's cabinet drew half its membership from private and independent schools. The party academic research shows also remains overwhelmingly white. The rank and file is hostile to multiculturalism, opposed to gay marriage, supportive of the death penalty, and very anti-Europe. Following Tarseem Sandhu's turban protest, the rising conservative star of the time, Enoch Powell, addressed his constituents in Walthamstow. To claim special communal rights, or I should say rights, leads to a dangerous fragmentation of society, Powell proclaimed in a now infamous 1968 speech. The rising number of immigrants, he went on, would inexorably allow them, and I quote, to consolidate their members, to agitate and campaign against their fellow citizens, and to overawe and to dominate the rest. In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, Powell prophesied, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. The rise of Sunak, of course, makes it tempting to imagine history as a great sense of humour. The somewhat sadistic anti-immigrant postures of key conservative politicians gives reason to think maybe that's not true. Braverman, after all, has said it's her obsession to see asylum seekers removed to Rwanda, not very far from the countries her parents and Sunak's parents came from. Like Braverman and other conservatives of colour, Sunak also supports deporting asylum seekers. He also says he'll condition future visas for countries like India on their governments accepting back illegal immigrants. Language like this is of significance in the context of British conservative politics. In the early 1960s, conservative populists like the MP Cyril Osborne had argued against immigration from the former colonies. In one interview, Osborne frankly proclaimed England was, and I quote, a white man's country and I wish it to remain so. The Conservative candidate Peter Griffith used flagrantly racist language in his 1964 election campaign. If you want a nigger neighbour, vote Liberal or Labour, went his slogan. Figures on the economic right wing of the Conservative Party, like Edward Boyle and Ian MacLeod, pushed back against this argument. They noted that immigrants were playing a critical role in industrial development and in stopping wages from spiraling upwards. Fears of social unrest, together with these arguments, led to-be Prime Minister Edward Heath to sack Enoch Powell from his shadow cabinet after that 1967 race speech. Any political life, Powell bitterly wrote in a book 10 years later, ends in failure. But he was wrong. His ideas didn't die. Early in 1978, leader of the opposition Margaret Thatcher, very soon to become Prime Minister, voiced the kinds of white fears that Enoch Powell had spoken of. People, she said, fear, I quote, this country might be swamped by people with a different culture. Following these remarks, Daniel Trilling notes, there was a dramatic shift in support away from Labour to Thatcher's Conservatives. Thatcher's race politics marked a dramatic swing away from the traditional conservatism of Heath to the strident white populism Powell had stood for. The hard line on immigration allowed her not just to win white working class support, but also to crush her opponents on the far right, like the British National Party. Thatcher also set in place the foundations of official multiculturalism, sociologist Jenny Bourne notes, enshrining a kind of informal apartheid that divided immigrant groups into distinct ethnic religious enclaves. The new policies focused on their purported cultural and religious needs rather than economic empowerment and equity. Learning from successive electoral defeats, David Cameron, who was to be Prime Minister from 2010 to 2016, moved to draw in greater numbers of ethnic minorities and women candidates. Much of the Conservative Party's leadership today is a product of Cameron's policies. A party that could appeal to urban liberal Britain, Cameron believed, was needed to roll back Labour. But the party lunged right again, with nationalists leveraging the Brexit issue to bring down Cameron. The Boris Johnson government's well known for Brexit, but it isn't so widely appreciated that it also brought whiteness back to centre stage. A report on race relations published by his government last year infamously suggested there might be room for a history, and I quote, that speaks to the slave period not only being about profit and suffering, but how culturally African people transformed themselves. The Prime Minister later backed away from the report, which was rightly accused of underplaying racial inequalities. Fantasies that England is entering a post-racial utopia are at some distance from the truth. The wash of colour over its political landscape hides a grim, grey social tide. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint. Thank you for listening to Security Code.